This is part 2 of a series. If you haven't seen my first video on the original Zelda game, be sure to check that out first. My earliest experiences with Zelda 2 are pretty much identical to those with the first Zelda game. I was a young Zelda fan and I had already played the more recent games, Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker, extensively, and I would soon get a taste of Ocarina of Time as well. Naturally, my love for these games led me deep down the rabbit hole of Zelda fan sites, where I learned much about the series, including its pioneering 8-bit duology. I never owned an NES and my GBA died a gruesome poultry-related death, so my only way of accessing these titles was through the expensive $45 The Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition for the Nintendo GameCube. Eventually, I was able to get my hands on that collection and I could finally experience those two ever-elusive games, the precursors to the games that held my heart. Same as the first Zelda, I knew the game's story all too well, having read many a second-hand account on ye old internet of 2005. I couldn't wait to finally see the events play out before me when I began my journey. In an age long past, Princess Zelda's evil brother would have a magician place a curse on her, sending her into an eternal sleep, all because she wouldn't tell him the location of the Triforce. Realizing what a douche he's been, he decides to lock his sister away in a palace in hopes that one day she would reawaken. Additionally, he decrees that every future princess of Hyrule, including the current princess from the first game, should be named Zelda in his sister's remembrance. This backstory truly is the Legend of Zelda. Never mind that Zelda 2 is the only game in the mainline series that's not even called The Legend of Zelda, at least outside of Japan. Also, never mind that as of 2011, Zelda 2 takes place at the very end of the Zelda timeline, with the Sleeping Zelda backstory only taking place sometime before the first Zelda game. I guess all the other Princess Zeldas throughout history were just named so coincidentally. Or maybe the decree that all princesses be named Zelda was actually made long ago, and the story of the Prince of Hyrule making that decree is actually just a misconception on Impa's part, as she's the one who tells Link the story in the first place. It is just a legend, after all. Anyways, Impa tells Link the story as the mark of the Triforce appears on the back of his hand on his 16th birthday. He then sets off on a journey to retrieve the rightful piece of the Golden Triangle, the long-dormant Triforce of Courage. Using the full Triforce, he would finally revive the sleeping Princess Zelda of old. The story is definitely more complex than the one behind the first Zelda game, and quite frankly, I couldn't wait to experience it firsthand. But after starting the first Zelda and finding that the backstory was completely absent from the game itself, my hopes for Zelda 2 were not very high. I switched over to Zelda 2 and, as expected, there was no story outside of a few words on the title screen. But what made Zelda 2 even worse than the first game was that it looked and felt nothing like a Zelda game. The original game, as primitive as it felt, still came across as the natural step towards what would eventually become the games that made me love the series. This was like some weird experimental RPG where you're pretty much just a tiny icon walking around a world map, avoiding enemy icons so you can do what? Walk into a side-scroller town and talk to townspeople that mostly all just say, hello. I didn't even know what I was doing, but the only things that even remotely reminded me that I'm playing a Zelda game were 1. I'm playing as Link in his traditional green hat and tunic, 2. The towns are named after characters from Ocarina of Time, or rather the creators would one day reuse those names for their newest game, Ocarina of Time, and 3. Game over, Return of Ganon. Did I mention this game was hard? I mean, the original Zelda was difficult, for sure, but this game cranks the difficulty up to the next rank by being far more action-focused and requiring a much higher level of finger dexterity. The game didn't feel like Zelda. Even the music didn't evoke that same Zelda feel, and that's due to the fact that, for whatever reason, the legendary Koji Kondo wasn't involved in the game's soundtrack. Instead, it was composed by Akito Nakatsuka, a man responsible for the classic music found in a handful of Nintendo's earliest NES and Famicom titles. Sadly, he hasn't done all that much since then. That said, Zelda-like or not, I would eventually come to truly enjoy many of the game's tracks, especially the Palace theme, which would remain relevant in the gaming community due to its appearance in Super Smash Bros. Melee and every subsequent Smash game. Anyways, after hopelessly shuffling about in Zelda 2's version of Hyrule like a goldfish fighting a shark, I turned the game right off and wouldn't touch it again for another few years. At that point, I screwed around for a bit until I found myself at the game's first palace. I don't recall if I managed to beat the palace or not, but I do know that I didn't make it much further than that before I once again lost interest. At that point, I knew all about the game's status among fans as being the black sheep of the Zelda family. It was to The Legend of Zelda what Castlevania 2 was to Castlevania, or what Super Mario Bros. 2 was to Super Mario Bros. It fell to the curse of being an NES sequel that took things in a far different direction than what was established in the original. What set Zelda 2 apart from its contemporaries was that even far more so than them, this game felt incredibly different from the original to the point of not even feeling like it's part of the same game series. If you were to trust the internet, you'd go as far as to say that Zelda 2 was a bad game. Me in 2008, I couldn't help but agree. It's weird, it's confusing, it's kind of ugly, it's insanely difficult, and it just doesn't feel like Zelda. This game sucks! In 2011, a few years later, I would play the first two Zelda games on my 3DS, which I received via the 3DS Ambassador program. I finally beat the original, so I was eager to continue on to Zelda 2. At this point, I had heard a wide assortment of opinions on the game via the internet. While the most common still stood by the game being bad, many people had come out of the woodwork to spout all sorts of praise, with some people even saying that, as of 2011, it's still their favorite game in the series. While I knew that I had no chance of loving the game to that degree, I was still hoping to at least somewhat enjoy the game this time, like I had with the original. While I didn't actually finish the game at this point in time, I did make it decently far into the game, and I couldn't even believe it myself, but I was having a lot of fun. I even liked it more so than the original Zelda. Zelda 2 is the closest the series would get to being a full-on action RPG, as defeating enemies will grant you experience points, which you use to level up your health, magic, and attack. Because each of the three stats can only be risen to level 8, each level up felt like it had a significant impact on your power, especially compared to a traditional RPG where a single level raise feels fairly insignificant. Because of the extremely rewarding nature of a level up in Zelda 2, grinding up those experience points actually felt fun. The strongest enemies that grant the most experience would be found in the palaces. After defeating the boss, the palace would no longer be accessible, so there was a bit of strategy involved in the grinding process. You basically want to milk each palace until you've reached a level where the number of experience points you gain from the palace's enemies barely scratches the surface of the amount you need to level up. Only then should you take on the boss. However, upon beating the boss, you automatically receive enough experience for a level up, which resets your experience back to 0. So that adds another layer of thought when it comes to grinding. Let's say you have 500 out of the 1000 points needed to level up. If you beat the boss, you'll get the rest of the experience you need to level up, which is 500 in this case. But if you only had 100 experience out of the 1000 needed, you'll receive 900 points from the boss. Basically, since you always get the exact number you need to level up, however many points you had upon fighting the boss are points that are wasted. So, you have 500 points out of the 1000 needed, and you're about to fight the boss. Do you sacrifice those 500 points, or do you wait it out and grind for the remainder of the experience so you can level up, resetting your points to 0, and then fight the boss for another full level up, sacrificing nothing? There's also point bags, which give you lots of points upon collection, but these don't respawn, so again, do you use them now, or do you save them to shorten the time of your next level? It's also worth noting that each time you level up, the points needed for another level up increases sometimes drastically, meaning it can possibly take twice as long to level up this time than it did last time. That's another thing to ponder when taking on a boss. The boss gives you a full level up. So, should you spend time grinding one level so that the next level, which should take much longer to fulfill, will instead go up in an instant from defeating the boss? I'm still not finished talking about the experience system, because there's yet another factor to consider. Another oddity exclusive to this Zelda game is the lives system. You die, you lose a life. When you lose all your lives, you get a game over, which sends you back to the game's starting area, the palace with the sleeping Zelda. Getting a game over is the ultimate punishment because it resets your experience back to 0. Imagine you just spent the last 45 minutes grinding in a particularly difficult palace. You're just a few more points away from leveling up, but since this game is so ridiculously difficult, you get a game over, and now your points are at 0, and all that time is wasted. If you picked up a point bag, but you haven't finished leveling up, that bag is gone forever, and the points you got from it are all gone and wasted. The feeling is less of a slap in the face and more of a violent stabbing. It's an awful feeling, and it's one that you're gonna feel over and over and over throughout the course of your adventure. You can get a Link doll, which acts as an extra life, but there are only a small handful in the game, and they're sometimes pretty hard to find. You might even lose a life just trying to find one. It's also because of this horrendous punishment that I'm stressing that you really have to think about your actions when it comes to grinding. I'm also talking about this in such detail because this is something you'll never have to worry about in any other game in the Zelda series. Like I said before, Zelda 2 is extremely different from the rest of the series in many regards. When you're playing Zelda 2, you're not getting anything close to what you could call the Zelda experience. Back to game overs. In addition to losing all your experience, you have to make your way back to where you were when you died from the game's starting point. This can be a very long way, meaning you'll sometimes have to fight some very dreadful foes along the way. You'll probably even lose one of your precious lives just getting back to where you need to be. Depending on your skill and how far you are in the game, you might even get a game over or 2 or 3 along the way, just getting back to where you were. You might finally make it back only to be on your last life with no magic, hardly any health, covered in scrapes and bruises, missing an eye and a couple of fingers, your feet hurt. And all the experience you gained along the way will be gone once you lose this next life. This game is hard. Did I mention I was having a lot of fun? Yes, to a point. The experience grinding is a lot of fun for the first half of the game, despite the punishing game overs, because of how rewarding a level up feels. The enemies are actually fun to fight because of the game's battle mechanics. Unlike the first Zelda, where you can more or less just whack enemies with your sword and cause damage, this game is a side-scroller and has you stabbing high, stabbing low, blocking high, blocking low against enemies that are doing the same thing against you. Eventually, you learn the downward thrust, a move familiar to anyone who's played a Smash Bros. Game, DuckTales, Shovel Knight, or Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. It allows you to jump above enemies and bounce off their heads with your sword. It's especially satisfying in Zelda 2 because you don't have that skill at first. It feels so good when you do unlock the ability and you're suddenly able to easily dispatch enemies that were once a lot more difficult to fight, beyond you just being more powerful from leveling up. Later on, you'll also learn the upward thrust, which finally lets you strike enemies that fly above your head just out of reach, that you really couldn't do anything about earlier on. I like how the game slowly distributes these skills over time rather than starting the game off with them. It gives you time to become better at the core combat before rewarding you with new attacks. And it's important that you get better at the combat because, like I said, this game is hard. There are also enemies that can't be defeated with the sword, so you'll have to utilize your magic spells, a first for the series. Some enemies can only be defeated with a fireball, while others can only be beaten by bouncing their magic beams back at them with your shield by using reflect magic. This spell is a precursor to the mirror shield found in a lot of future Zelda games. Magic spells in Zelda 2 use up your magic meter, a series staple that originated in this game. And though future Zelda games would have all sorts of uses for magic, I don't believe any of them can compare to the magic in Zelda 2, where almost every spell is an invaluable asset in your journey that you'll use countless times if you have any hope of ever beating the game. Zelda 2 has a lot of variety gameplay-wise, and every action you have at your disposal feels useful, and that's precisely another reason I found the game so fun to play. Zelda 2 also introduces towns to the series, and there's quite a few of them. They all have the same music and look pretty much identical, aesthetically speaking. They have the same few NPCs, the ones with the same generic line, the ones that introduce you into their house to heal your health or magic, and the ones that give you a clue on what you need to do next. Sometimes they'll need your help, tasking you with finding their stolen idol, their missing kid, their lost mirror, etc. Some towns have people that are actually Ganon's minions in disguise and will transform into monsters and attack you if you talk to them, which is Honestly kind of annoying considering towns are supposed to be a safe haven. Just make sure to talk to the town healer before you do anything else in a town, just to be safe. Helping out the citizens of the game's towns grants you access to their wizards or knights that will teach you new spells or attacks for your journey. It's all very simple, but it's just enough to make Hyrule feel alive and way more interesting than the desolate, apocalypse-like world of the first game. A well-known and very interesting fact about this game is that you can find a tiny miniature version of the first Zelda's overworld in the game's map. It implies how small of a space the original Zelda took place in compared to the full size of Hyrule seen in Zelda 2. It also shows how small of a part of Death Mountain you got to explore in the first Zelda, compared to how large it appears relatively in Zelda 2. The best sequels are the ones that expand on the world and lore of the prior games, so that when you go back, you think about things differently. The Zelda series excels at this, and the developers of Zelda 2 deserve praise for being the first to connect the games in such a way, despite Zelda 2 feeling so drastically different otherwise. For a game that is so fundamentally different from the rest of its series, from a story and world building perspective, Zelda 2 does manage to add to the series as a whole with a small number of significant introductions I already mentioned. I didn't beat the game in 2011, but I did give it another try much later on the NES Classic Edition. Like before, the game starts out fun, only to become decidedly less fun as the difficulty cranks up. While the combat is definitely challenging, I rarely, if ever, found it to be unfun or unfair. The challenge comes from the harsh punishment inflicted upon the player when they screw up. And the player will screw up a lot as the palaces get bigger and more maze-like, and as they fight bosses of patterns you can't easily learn and practice on because of the live system. For me, I honestly don't know how I would beat the game and still retain my mental health if it wasn't for the suspend system on the NES Classic. You can call me a filthy, cheating moblin all you like, but the real cheaters are the level designers that put in parts of difficult jumps that can result in, if you're lucky, falling to the floor into the wrong part of the palace, making you retrace your way through super hard enemies just to get another chance to make the jump again, or if you're unlucky, instant death. Have I mentioned this game's life system? There is one part of the game where I had to make a suspend point at the beginning of a room because of enemies that kept knocking me into lava. I must have reloaded my suspend point 30 times because I kept dying and dying and dying. I can hardly imagine playing this on an original NES. I would have gotten game over 10 times and had to make it all the way back to and through the palace. It would have taken hours to beat that palace. And don't even get me started on the Great Palace, the final area of the game, and the caves leading up to it. It was at that point where any cheater's guilt I had about abusing the suspend points went flying out the window at the speed of the goddess's light. So yeah, the game is fun, but to a point. At its best, the game far outshines its predecessor, but at its hardest, the game honestly makes me wonder how anyone can possibly say with a straight face that they love Zelda 2, that it's the best game in the series. This game is a masterpiece, says the Zelda 2 superfan, unironically, after losing 5,000 experience points gained over the past hour of playtime because he miscalculated a jump, and now he has to spend another hour just to do it all over again. Zelda 2 is fun, but it's also a game for masochists. I once told myself that I like Zelda 2 more than the first Zelda, but that was before I had actually played through the latter half of the game. My current stance on the first Zelda is that it's kinda fun. My stance on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, is that it's great, except for when it's horrible.